Great. Okay. So as I've publicized, we're going to be speaking about the Jewish perspective on unconscious bias. What is it? How far do we factor it into our daily lives? Is there anything that we can do about it? And there is a surprisingly large amount of literature from early sources, surprisingly, on this subject. So it was illuminating to me as I had maybe the first couple inklings of where to begin, and it really opened up a can of worms that that proved really fruitful and can really give us a lot of direction. So I also mentioned that the impetus for this was the more local political events taking place right now around the kind of Black Lives Matter movement that's taking place, but it's obviously a much bigger subject, something that is very widely encompassing around all areas of life. Everything affects us both consciously and unconsciously. And what we're going to see, hopefully, is that Freud was not the first person to be in great awe of the amount of our decisions and behavior that originate from below the conscious level of human thought. All right, without further ado, for those who know my style, I'm going to be drawing from real sources so that everybody can see where they're coming from, and by all means, if anybody has any questions at any point on the sources or my interpretation of the sources, feel free to interject. All right, I'm going to share the screen now. That is my WhatsApp, and that is my source sheet. So the first thing that we're going to look at is one of my favorite sources on this particular topic. Just how far-reaching is the subconscious, is the unconscious? How much do we have to take it into account in our lives? So there is a law that is written about in Sanhedrin 18b, which is in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. Either a king nor a high priest are seated on a court for creating a leap year. So back when there was a high court, there was not a fixed Jewish calendar. Essentially, the calendar was locally determined by month, by the visibility of the new moon. So you'd have witnesses come and say, we've seen the crescent moon, and they would come ride into Jerusalem and testify before the high court. Okay, today is the first of the month. And that's how the first of the month was created. Now, that obviously follows a lunar calendar, but in the Jewish calendar, unlike the Muslim calendar, which is purely lunar, which is why you can have Ramadan fall out in the middle of the summer and then several years later in the middle of the winter, the Jewish calendar is both lunar, but is attached to the solar rotation. The reason being because several of our holidays have to be affixed to certain times during the year. So Pesach, for example, has to be in the springtime. Sukkot has to be during the fall. And so for that reason, every so often when it looked as if the two calendars were becoming too divided, then you had to introduce another month into the calendar. They'd create a leap year, which would add a month effectively to that year. And the high court would determine whether this was a year that required the month. Now, since we no longer have that high court, the Sanhedrin, there was kind of a fixed calendar that was scheduled. It's something that rotates every 19 years, and there are a certain number of leap years effectively within those 19 years. But back then, they used to testify. So who is prevented, who's not permitted to testify whether or not there should be a leap year this year? Two people, the king and the Kohen Gadol. The king, because of the sustenance of soldiers. In other words, the king would pay a yearly wage to the soldiers, and he therefore had a vested interest in creating a leap year because he effectively gets 13 months of work out of his soldiers for only 12 months worth of pay. And that was considered too much of a vested interest of having a personal a personal bias, being too partial to the matter for the king to be a trustworthy judge. The high priest, on the other hand, is something much more subtle. A high priest does not serve as a judge concerning the matter due to the cold. What, pray tell, is the cold? So Rashi tells us, the Kohen Gadol will not want to create a leap year because of the cold, since he will be required to immerse and sanctify himself on Yom Kippur. Now, by the way, this decision was made around February time. So we're talking 7 months later, on Yom Kippur, he will be required to immerse himself 5 times, 10 sanctifications, all things involving water. If a month is added to the year, then Tishrei, which is the month where we have Yom Kippur, will be in Cheshvan, which is the month that should be after the month of Yom Kippur. And the cold of Cheshvan will be in Tishrei. So in modern language, that would basically be saying that instead of Yom Kippur being in September, it's now going to be in October. And for that reason, there will be the ever so slightest inclination for the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, to want there not to be a leap year this year, because it will mean the water will be a few degrees colder. Now, let's just contextualize this so that we can understand the implications of this legal ruling in the Talmud. The Kohen Gadol is largely seen as the most spiritually elevated individual of the generation, hands down. The person who is the only person permitted to go into the Holy of Holies, where it says that is where the presence of God rests, in the temple. This individual, we are concerned that he will be somehow affected by the fact that the water will be ever so slightly cooler. Now, mind you, this is also taking place in Israel, and those who know that what the temperature is like in October in Israel is not significantly different or colder than the temperature in September. That is how far-reaching we are concerned that the Kohen Gadol will be inversely affected and will become partial to that decision because of that fine, minute outcome 7 months later. Okay? So whether this is conscious or unconscious, we are very, very concerned about bias in the Torah. Okay? The next example of this, of course, takes place in the widely discussed law, which originates in the Torah, that a judge, understandably so, is not permitted to take any bribery. Now the question is, what are the parameters of a bribe according to the Torah? So here I've singled out a couple of the most incredible, as in not credible, cases of what's considered bribery. A Maimar was sitting and judging a case when a feather floated and landed on his head. A certain man came by and removed it. The Maimar said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I have a case to present before you." The Maimar said to him, "I am now disqualified from presiding over your case because you removed a feather from my head." And that on its own will be too much for me to ignore when I'm trying to be impartial in a case that I judge. Next case, there was spit lying before Mar Ukva, which was unsightly. A certain man came by and covered it. He said, "What are you doing?" He said to him, "I have a case to present to you." Mar Ukva said, "I am disqualified from presiding over your case." And the Gemara continues, there are even more outlandish examples of how fine and minute examples of bribery might be. And so we are so concerned about our bias that we have to really, really exert a lot of effort. The next one, and this one is incredible. I know where the class is going, and I still don't know how this next example is possible to overcome, but it is forever emblazoned in the codification of Jewish law, according to Maimonides and many others. And Maimonides tells us, based on a medrash, which is an early rabbinic source in the Oral Torah, if two people came before a judge, one observant and one wicked, one, right, the Hebrew is one kasher and one rasha, okay? There's a kosher guy and there's a wicked person. Okay, so imagine you have a, you know, a respected, righteous pillar of the community on the one hand, and somebody who's been convicted of insurance fraud as the other litigant. He should not say, since he is wicked, and it can be presumed that he is lying, and conversely, it can be assumed that the other litigant does not falsify his statements, I'll be biased against the wicked in judgment. With regard to this, it says, do not be biased in the judgment of the poor person. How does this verse describe what Maimonides just said? The intent is, even if a person is poor in the observance of mitzvot, do not be biased in your judgment. So we are seriously concerned, and we hold our judges, and we will soon see ourselves, to an exorbitantly high standard when it comes to making sure that we treat people with the utmost equality, even if you could imagine that they didn't deserve so. Okay? Now this, I think, is something that we in the 21st century would strive to do as well. I don't know if we've codified it as such, to such an extent, but we certainly would hope that our judges today are that impartial. And we hope for ourselves that when we look at individuals, we try not to judge them too harshly. So this is the extent of the biases that we're concerned for. And of course, we have to be very wary of where our biases come from. Maimonides, this is a famous selection from Maimonides in his Mishneh Torah, writes on the nature of human character. It is natural for a man's character and actions to be influenced by his friends and associates, and for him to follow the local norms of behavior. We are unbelievably affected by the norms of our society. Okay? I've read fascinating literature on cultural norms and cultural biases, and the extent that people, and this is really something that is amazing because we take it for granted because everybody around us acts the same way. But if you go to another culture, you know, anybody here who's spent any time kind of embedded in another culture will immediately pick up on some deeply held assumptions and convictions and beliefs that are completely challenged when you go to a foreign culture. Therefore, he should associate with the righteous and be constantly in company of the wise so as to learn from their deeds. Conversely, he should keep away from the wicked who walk in darkness so as not to learn from their deeds. All right, how far do you have to go to try to uphold this? If all the places with which he is familiar and all of which he hears reports follow improper paths, as in our times, I love that. You can get a glimpse into the 12th century of Egypt, where the Rambam is living and writing, and he's basically saying there exists no such place where there's only righteous people or where there are righteous enough people, right? So he says, or if he's unable to move where the patterns of behavior are proper because of the presence of bands of raiding troops or health reasons. So if there's, for some reason, you're unable to leave this wicked society, he should remain alone in seclusion. Quarantine yourself. There is a spiritual pandemic going around, and you have to rather live totally in isolation than to associate with wicked people, because even the strongest character of an individual will be susceptible to influence by those around that person. If they are wicked and sinful, these individuals, and do not allow him to reside there unless he mingle with them and follow their evil behavior. So awful are these people that they won't even leave you alone. You have to engage in their evil behavior. He should go out to caves, thickets, and deserts rather than follow the paths of sinners, as it states, who will give me a lodging place for wayfarers in the desert. Okay, so it comes from everywhere. Our biases. It affects us extremely deeply. And before I move on to the next section, which is going to be how deeply embedded is this unconscious bias? Where is it rooted? How much of it is part of us, and how much of it is something that can be easily dispensed with? Before I go to that next section, are there any questions so far? Okay, no questions so far.
not a question, but more comment. You were saying about whether the
Yeah.
English or whether secular systems have the same degree of codification when it comes to bias and apparent bias of judges. And the short answer is unfortunately not. And that's led to some very interesting conundra, including in the case of General Pinochet, when he came before the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom. One of the judges didn't declare that his wife was a trustee of a charity, which was Amnesty International, which was an interested party in the case. And it actually led to new authority being written on apparent bias, because it didn't occur to him to declare a thing like that.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So Austin, thank you for your barristorial background and experience. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that I would imagine that as individuals, we would hope that people strive for this ideal, but as I said, it certainly isn't codified. It certainly is not codified, and we're going to see to what extent the Torah exerts effort to actually make changes that we can work against our biases, which is a very interesting thing. And I would imagine that it's something that could be easily rectified in our culture as well. That's going to be section 3, where I discuss what we can actually do to try to counteract our biases. Okay, so any other questions or comments?
Moshe, it's just a very general one. I mean, it's possibly something I was going to say near the end. You know that I very much come from the medrash aspect of things, and not necessarily halacha, which is what you're doing here. But of course, one of the things that's to me so extraordinary about medrash is the emphasis it puts on the unconscious motives, desires, and it's mainly sort of dealing with narrative. And character study, it's actually quite amazing to see it here, actually, sort of this nexus sort of being sort of brought together between that sort of the existence of as it were, the unconscious as an idea, but when it's sort of brought in together, it's brought into contact with halacha, with law, as it were. So this is very interesting to me. As I said, I'm used to the idea of the unconscious in medrash as a Jewish textual idea, but it's just very fascinating to see this now actually be brought in and codified, as you said. So it's just a kind of passing thought and just
yeah. I mean, look. So first of all, Leah, you and I are going to have a brainstorming session where you can share with me all of the incredible sources that you've gathered on the subject. But again, I agree with you. I think that the fact that these things have been codified into law tells us that there must be a remedy, that it's demanded of us behaviorally to try to counteract these biases, and to try to be aware of our unconscious. So let's see how this plays out. Okay, how difficult is it to remove our unconscious biases? How intrinsic is it to us? This is a really fascinating subject, because it gets into the concept that there is a distinction made in Jewish law between acts that are committed intentionally and acts that are committed unintentionally. Now, that might not sound crazy to you, because if I unintentionally break your property, that doesn't matter. I still have to pay for it. However, it is fascinating to see that even in ritualistic matters where there's no damage, right, caused. I accidentally turn a light on Shabbos, or or I accidentally eat the wrong piece of meat, whatever that might be. There are halachic repercussions for that as well. There are prescriptions given in terms of sacrifices that have to be made of atonement, right? Animal sacrifice or flower sacrifice, whatever it is that it calls for. And so there is an understanding that there is something to ask forgiveness for and something to repent and do teshuvah on, even when it's accidental in nature. And the question is going to be why, okay? So the first source that I want to bring here is a beautiful piece from the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal, a 15th century commentary, who's a rabbi, you can still see his synagogue in Prague today, considered to be the grandfather of modern, of true Jewish philosophy and Hasidic thought. The Maharal of Prague is attempting to explain which is worse, an intentional sin or an unintentional sin. And this is what he says. One who sinned unintentionally, even though regarding the severity of the sin, it is considered as an accident. So obviously, somebody who sinned unintentionally, if I murder somebody, that's far less egregious than somebody who accidentally killed somebody. Nonetheless, granting forgiveness for it is less attainable. Or perhaps seeking forgiveness for it is less attainable, since the error is more intrinsic to the individual because he acted instinctively. Now, what does he mean by this? One who acts maliciously can be forgiven through his admitting that he erred and now regrets the act. But the unintentional act is much more a part of that person, as we see how he behaved instinctively and not with any particular intention. His behavior cannot be attributed to some misguided thought, as a malicious deed can. In other words, what the Maharal is suggesting is that even though the act of an intentional transgression is far worse, it's much easier to cleanse from oneself, and that should be intuitive, right? If I commit a seriously misguided deed against a particular person whom I bear resentment for, and then all of a sudden I have some epiphany that, like, that's not the way to solve problems. It's not the way to deal with people that you dislike. Or if I learn that, for example, they weren't deserving of my violence. So then even though I was violent to that person and I have no excuses, I can easily ask forgiveness. I can say, oh my gosh, I've made a terrible mistake. That person's not an evil person, or I shouldn't be behaving in this way. What an awful thing to do. However, on the other hand, let's say you do something almost by rote. You do something without thinking about it. So we could say that that's not as egregious of an act because I didn't bear any malice towards you. I wasn't trying to hurt you. And yet, the fact that I committed that act without even thinking about it suggests a very, very deep, perhaps passivity or even negligence or even deeper ill will than I would even want to admit to. And yet it still manifested itself in some sort of behavior. Now that behavior is much, much more difficult to fix because it's deeply ingrained in who we are. Okay? Continuing in that line is a very old source from Rav Saadia Gaon, who I believe was an 8th century communal leader during what's known as the time of the Gaonim, which is the post-Talmudic period, so from around 230, 250 of the Common Era, until around 850 or 900 of the Common Era. It was an area where we have not many writings from that time. Considering it was, several hundred years, we only have, a few dozen works from that entire period of time. But one of the most important works that remained was this philosophical work by Rav Saadia Gaon called Ha'emunos v'Hadeos, Beliefs and Ideas, I guess, where he treats, again, this notion of unintentionality. It is fitting for me to explain that a person does nothing unless he or she wants it to happen. Just let those words sink in by themselves. We could stop here and say, wow. A person does nothing unless he or she wants it to happen. For it does not make sense that someone should do something without any will, especially one who is capable of having intentions. And this is what we see, that when the Torah prescribes punishment for one who committed a transgression unintentionally, it's not because the individual had no will. If I literally had nothing to do with my behavior, totally accidental. I mean, you can imagine if somehow I was turned into a zombie or a puppet and I committed an act, there is no legal ramification for that. So for example, it's spoken about a case where we know that I will have to give up my life rather than kill someone else, right? So one of the 13th century commentaries, the Tosfos, ask the question, they ask, what if somebody says, I'm going to tie you up and then push you onto an infant, crushing the infant? Would you have to give up your life for that? And Tosfos says, no, because you're not the agent in that deed. So in that case, there's no will, no intention whatsoever. But Rav Saadia Gaon says that's not the same thing as behaving accidentally. Accident is no accident. It just appears that way on the surface. It's not because the individual had no will, but because those influences were hidden from him or her. We've said similarly that one who kills another person by accident, who is attempting to chop wood but acted unintentionally. You're attempting to chop wood, but you let the axe fly from your hand, okay, accidentally killing somebody. Or one who transgresses Shabbat when intending to collect wood but forgot that it was the day of Shabbat. That's another example of accident, right, where you forgot that it was Shabbat. In both of these cases, Rav Saadia Gaon is suggesting that there is a much deeper influence that is causing you to behave in this way. So we see that we are not only very concerned about our unconscious behavior, but we are forced to take ultimate responsibility for our unconscious behavior. You can't just say, oh, that was an accident. That's beyond my control. The suggestion here is that no, it is within your control. All right, and now we begin the final section, which is a slightly longer section, which is practical ways to undo unconscious bias. Are there any questions before we begin this section? Questions or comments? Okay, the silence to me suggests that everybody is on the page, everyone has no qualms or questions, there's nothing controversial about what I'm saying. There probably is, but maybe you're just not picking up on it. Okay, thank you, Leah, for the thumbs up. All right. Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the Orat Safon. Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who was considered one of the greatest Jewish educators of the 20th century. He was the great spiritual leader of the yeshiva in Slobodka in the first few decades of the 20th century. From his yeshiva came almost every great rabbinic figure of the 20th century, of the second half of the 20th century. People such as Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rav Hutner, Rav Aaron Cutler, Rav Meir Chadosh, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher. I mean, the list goes on. The list goes on. The number of people who founded yeshivas, the number of people who were looked to as the giants of their generation came from him. And part of it had to do with his ability to build people up, to make people aware of their inner self and their inner potential. And here he's discussing the dire necessity of an individual to be able to be aware of the biases that he or she possesses. Only philosophizers and academics who have no idea how much their character and their beliefs are capable of bribing the mind and bringing a person to blindness and distortion can extol themselves as being objective in their beliefs and guided only by the light of truth. Only people like these who have not merited to benefit from the illumination of the teachings of Musar, Musar being the Jewish pursuit of personal character development and perfection, and are not experts in the wily psychological powers of the human mind, can actually believe in the verity of their beliefs and thoughts, but not those who have exerted themselves in the teachings of Musar and found in it a plethora of complex and vast ideas, some of which we've seen tonight, which have been revealed through the words of the Torah and the sages, who understood the powers of the self and their deceits. These people know how to measure this perceived objectivity and how naive and ridiculous it is to make such a claim. So step one, obviously, is to admit and acknowledge that unconscious bias exists, that we are highly affected by it, and that unless we start digging, a lot of what we do will be informed by things that are not conscious decisions. Now, a person could read this and say, gosh, I'm really not in control of myself. And the answer is, yeah. I mean, it's not to be, and I don't want to be, I don't want to be dark and defeatist here, because what we're ultimately going to be doing is looking at ways to ameliorate this. But anybody who's dabbled at all in any type of behavioral economics, works of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and the list goes on, Richard Thaler, Dan Ariely, knows how easy it is to unconsciously manipulate another human being. So step number one, admit you've got a problem. Okay, this is Unconscious Bias Anonymous here. All right, now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you three different prospective remedies towards unconscious bias. Now, there are probably many more. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I am taking a sample representation of three different approaches that we can take to trying to fix unconscious bias. The first one is brought in the Talmud Bavli in Shavuos 31a. From where is it derived with regard to two individuals who came to judgment, one dressed in rags and one dressed in a garment worth 100 dinars? Okay, that's a very expensive suit. That the judges say to the wealthy person, dress like the poor person, or dress the poor person in a garment like yours. From where do we know that this is an obligation? It is derived, as the verse states, distance yourself from a false matter. To avoid falsehood, to avoid giving false judgment, you are obligated to dress the two litigants in as close to the same dress as possible. Okay? When individuals would come before Rava bar Rav Huna, he would say to them, remove your fine shoes and descend for judgment, so you will not appear more distinguished than the other litigant. So the first example here that I've brought is a very simple and practical one, but that has far-reaching consequences, which is simply, even the way that we dress creates biases unconsciously in our mind. And if you wanted to take a very practical measure, try to eliminate as many of those external stimuli as possible. I was told recently that there is a serious issue with this in the United States. And it has to do with people who are arraigned, who are arrested and can post bail and get out of prison, and people who cannot. People who can afford to post bail go home, they take a shower, and they show up to court in a suit. People who cannot are kept in prison and show up to court in a jumpsuit, in a prison outfit. And the latest data that has been released shows overwhelmingly that, and unsurprisingly, that juries are highly influenced by what the defendant is wearing. The defendant is wearing a prison outfit. There's no way that you could imagine that that doesn't leave some impression on the jury. And the fact that this has to do with whether or not somebody can afford to post bail is probably a prime example of systematic inequality before the law when it comes to economic backgrounds. Okay, so that's the first example. Very real, very practically. Just change the way that people are viewed. Make sure that people that we try to eliminate as many of the external factors that would influence our judgment in court and elsewhere, and you'll start to notice a difference. Okay. Second example. The second way of treating this is brought by Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, who is a revered rabbi and teacher in a yeshiva in the Telz Yeshiva in the United States in the 20th century, post-World War II. And Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch here speaks about the power of ritual, of a certain kind to be able to affect the unconscious. Says Rabbi Bloch, in the Parsha of the Sota, it says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them. Okay, so the Parsha of the Sota, which was actually in the Parsha 2 weeks ago, okay, Parsha's Naso, is a fascinating Parsha whereby a woman, a married woman, secludes herself with a man other than her husband in front of 2 witnesses, and the husband is filled with such a sense of jealousy and suspicion that he takes her to the Kohen, and this fascinating ritual is performed where she is made to drink a type of water with the name of God dissolved in it. And should she be found guilty, were she to be guilty, then essentially she would distend and explode, as would her lover, as would her male lover. And this is one of the only instances in the Torah where there is a spiritual outcome in some sort of legal decision, right? No other legal matter is left to the miraculous in order to determine, except for this one. Now, in addition to that whole ritual, there's another ritual which the verse speaks about here. If any man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him, the man shall bring his wife to the priest, the Kohen, and he shall bring as an offering for her. Okay, this is like her sacrifice, her offering, 1/10 of an ephah of barley kemach, which is a certain type of flour. Okay, no oil shall be poured upon it, and no frankincense shall be laid on it. And these are things that normally go into the mixture of a sacrifice. And Rashi says kemach implies that it should not be fine sifted flour, it should be coarse. It must be barley and not wheat, because she committed a bestial act, and therefore shall her offering consist of that which is food for beasts. In other words, barley is considered animal food, and she did something animalistic in nature. He shall pour no oil upon it, so that her offering shall not be embellished. And also because oil is light while she acted in the darkness, so there's very subtle symbolism going on here. Nor shall he put frankincense thereon, because the matriarchs are symbolically termed frankincense. As it is said, I will get me to the hill of frankincense, which is taken as allusion to the matriarchs, while she deviated from their path. So she did not act piously and righteously as the matriarchs did, and so she does not deserve this spice, which is an allusion to the matriarchs. Now, asks Rabbi Bloch, the simple understanding of the text is clear that all of this is to grade the act of the sota and to make it despised in order to make an impression on the woman so that she clearly recognizes the wickedness of the act, or it is for the sake of those who are watching and listening, so that it makes an impression on them so they will recognize the wickedness of the act and distance themselves from it. It is thus required that the sacrifice be made in this manner so that it will highlight the sinfulness of these deeds. But, he says, something does not sit well with us. Typo. Was it not possible to find a more obvious and recognizable sign which might make an even stronger visceral impression? Aren't these signs nearly impossible to pick up on? So what impression could there possibly be for them? Think about the symbolism. Anybody who's watching this, you'd have to have a fine eye for detail to notice, A, that it was coarse flour instead of fine flour, B, that it was barley instead of wheat, C, that there was no oil mixed into it because oil represents light, and D, that there was no frankincense mixed into it because frankincense represents the ways of the matriarchs. These are deeply, incredibly subtle changes that somehow are supposed to evoke some response. So how does Rabbi Bloch understand what is the meaning behind this symbolism if it is so nuanced that it would be almost impossible, almost imperceptible? He says, it is important to know that the impression that small symbols like these leave are not as weak as we may have imagined. Now, by the way, just think about this. This was written in I believe, the 60s, the 70s. This is well before, the advent of modern behavioral economics that we understand today. All of those tests that some of you might be familiar with, the Florida test and these these bias tests, even if they are not strongly felt, nonetheless it leaves a real impression on one's being and acts upon it. As we know that there are many stimuli that act upon a person's internal stirrings without one being aware of them at all. We see all the time that a person acts without paying any attention, and it seems that no arousal of any kind of will had caused that person to do it. But it cannot make sense, and by the way, listen to this next sentence and try not to hear Rav Sadia Gaon's words being echoed. It cannot make sense that a person acts without having any sort of arousal in his or her inner being, where one could find some force that catalyzes that act. We find, therefore, that there are imperceptible arousals that act within a person's being without being aware of it at all. Similarly, there are things that make an impression on a person and move his or her inner self, even if they cannot perceive them and are not aware even of the inner movement it is causing. So the first thing he says is that don't be fooled. Small acts, small imperceptible acts do have a real effect. In the same way that they're imperceptible parts of the unconscious self that act upon us, and they're imperceptible, so too external influences that are nearly imperceptible to the conscious mind do have an influence on our behavior. But he goes even further than this. All of this has inspired in me a novel thought, something that is perhaps the exact opposite of what we are accustomed to thinking, but it appears to be true. It is possible that the desired outcome can only be achieved through things like these that do not cause any noticeable reaction, but only leave subtle impressions which reach the fine filaments of the soul and awaken them. In other words, our ends can be achieved only through nearly imperceptible stimuli and not through greater, more perceptible ones. When greater, more affective spectacles occur, even at the moment of their occurrence, it looks like they make a greater impression on a person and bring him or her to an overwhelming emotional change. But in truth, they are not usually so effective. Precisely because they outwardly affect a person, that's what causes them not to penetrate deeply enough to touch the person's finer qualities. Only through the subtle, unnoticeable impressions which do not arouse us or bring some great response, those reach the desired finer qualities. So, says Rabbi Bloch, if you want to influence the imperceptible unconscious behavior, use imperceptible stimuli that bypass the conscious mind and go straight into the unconscious. A beautiful, beautiful idea, and something that is probably, probably well researched today, well researched enough for us to say that this is, this is proven scientifically true. And what it does, the power of this is twofold. Number one, it shows us exactly how, one very effective way of dealing with our unconscious bias, which is to introduce imperceptible nudges, essentially, into our daily lives that ever so slightly shift our behavior. And it's, now I'm not sold either way in what I'm about to tell you, but it's now understandable the efforts that are being made, for example, to simply add diversity to your average television advertisement, to have some interracial couple, or to try to include more females as leading characters in children's television shows, which is something that there was an excellent Freakonomics podcast on, that Gina Davis, the famous actress of the 90s, basically led this initiative to basically show that of the children's television shows and films, something like 20% of them had female leading roles. And today, by contrast, it's now something much closer to 50%. So that within 10 years, she was able to effect a massive change. And these are things that are imperceptible, that you don't notice, how many female protagonists there are in the shows that we show to children, but you get a very, very subtle, very, unconscious message when you're shown how few of them there actually are. So that would be a good example of that type of thing. All right. Any comments? Have I offended anybody at this point? Have I overstepped my bounds? All right. Again, silence is golden. I'll assume that I'm doing a good job here. All right. So, the first strategy that we saw was overt external changes in things like dress, so that we can begin to treat people on a more level playing field, because we know, no matter how much we're aware that somebody who's rich and somebody who's poor deserve the same treatment, we still obligate ourselves to change the way that they dress. The second example was one that involves imperceptible ritual and small, slight nudges to our surroundings. The third one is going to be a much more direct approach. The third one is going to be directly from the Musar school, the personal self-development school, which is something that a person can go from A to Z, recognize a bias, make it conscious, exert certain behavior and work and effort to undo that bias, and consciously work to eradicate it. That's going to be the final example, and we're going to see the way in which this is done. The way in which this was outlined was none other than the founder of the Musar movement, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who lived in the 19th century. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, many legendary things have been said about him, about his character, about how he was not only the embodiment of comportment, of dignity, of self-respect, but also a massive, massive Torah scholar, somebody who was widely revered as one of the preeminent halachic authorities of his time, and also somebody who was very, very real, very real. He famously, during the cholera epidemic, came to shul, and on Erev Yom Kippur, right before Yom Kippur was to begin, he got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, it is our understanding from the greatest doctors of our day that anybody who is fasting is more susceptible to the disease, and therefore I have decided, I'm officially declaring that it is forbidden for anybody to fast this entire Yom Kippur." And right then and there, he made kiddush in the shul for everybody. He did other phenomenal things as well, but just as a testament to his convictions and his character and his realness. So, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, what does he say? The study of Musar is obligatory for man, and especially for a person who is preoccupied with his affairs. In other words, somebody who's involved in worldly affairs, whose divine service is hampered by spiritual illness. This is so even though it is no easy matter to apply Musar study to treat a grave illness in need of powerful ministrations. So we have this need for Musar, which we'll soon describe what these processes are, the act of personal self-development and perfection. Let us try and understand this. Turning our attention to man's intellectual powers, we find that the process of comprehending something begins with an attempt to achieve clarification. This course proceeds with great difficulty. For example, consider a child who begins to study Hebrew. His first task is to learn the proper pronunciation of the words. At this stage, his teacher must exert great effort in order to teach him the individual letters and help him string together a complete word. The child must work mightily to be able to learn how to read letters and words. However, once he acquires the necessary skills, each child according to his natural ability, he reads easily with no deliberation. The psychologists called this process of learning a function of the inner powers of man. During the initial phase, when the child is learning to read, he must employ the, I might add, conscious power of clarification, i.e. the conscious mind. Afterwards, reading is a function of the subconscious mind. We can apply this model to the realm of emotions as well, as there are both conscious factors and subconscious ones. The subconscious forces are stronger and produce powerful results with minimal stimulation. For example, the love of a father for his children is a function of the subconscious mind. In general, this love is almost imperceptible to the man himself. However, it ignites to a roaring fire with even the slightest stimulation. Likewise, man's earthly desires are manifest in the subconscious. When there is no stimulation, their existence is almost imperceptible. Because of this, they wield tremendous power over man. So, he says that our unconscious mind has considerable sway. First of all, because they're imperceptible. And so we don't realize how much of a power they exert over us. That alone is power. But second of all, because they're so deeply embedded, when they are triggered, they release a wildfire of response, right? So it's the times that are the most trying when we see what a human being's character really is made of. You know, we half jokingly suggest that the holiday of Purim mirrors the holiday of Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippur, right? It's called in the Torah Yom Kippurim, which if you're one of the famous Hasidic rabbis, the Bnei Yissaschar, says Yom Kippurim could be translated as the day like Purim. Why? Because it's one thing to be on a high spiritual level on a day of Yom Kippur when you're fasting and you're in shul all day. That's easy. It's easy to gain an elevated perspective when you're pretending to be an angel. But that's nothing compared to an individual who has integrated their sterling behavior so deeply that even on Purim, when you're totally drunk, you're still through and through a mensch. If you've reached that level on Purim, then you know how deeply integrated that righteousness really is. And as a side note, they used to say about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter that the entire day of Purim, Rabbi Salanter would drink and drink and drink, and his closest students could not tell that he was intoxicated until the moment he passed out on the floor. So he was no joker. He was no joker. He lived what he preached. All right, let's see how he suggests how we do this. In other words, so we see that there's a process of conscious clarification, something that has to be repeated painstakingly over and over, like learning to read. But once you've got it, then it becomes second nature, becomes rote, it becomes something that's unconscious. Musar study is founded upon and begins as an aspect of clarification in relation to emotional arousal. Now, this is going to be the opposite of Rabbi Bloch. Okay, Rav Bloch said, don't create any emotional, external emotional arousal. It should be so imperceptible that it bypasses our conscious mind. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is going to suggest a more proactive approach. You have to start with something that really emotionally affects you and impacts you. Now, in most cases, man does not have the innate strength to master his desires, which are based in the subconscious and are naturally very powerful. But, right, as we've been saying, it's incredibly difficult to reckon with our subconscious desires. They will almost always win. But just as in the realm of intellectual endeavor, each session of clarification learning makes an impression on the subconscious. So too, the fervor aroused in the soul through Musar study makes an impression on the subconscious. It is important to point out that the only way a learned skill can be made second nature is through initial conscious effort. For if this weren't true, it would be unnecessary to employ conscious study in order to generate reflex knowledge in the subconscious. Moreover, this educational process will only succeed if there is not an extended interval between study sessions, so that the impressions on the subconscious will not be diminished and nullified with the passage of time, and one will not have to begin anew each time in a process that would repeat itself ad infinitum. So, what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is pointing out here is, first step is you have to create a strong powerful emotional response inside of yourself, okay? And then you have to repetitively regenerate that process and that experience, ideally on a daily level, so that it can get deeper and deeper and more deeply and deeply ingrained. The same process of learning applies to emotional arousal. Every emotional arousal that a person engages in makes an impression on the subconscious. Eventually, the impressions engendered by each study session regarding a particular area will join together, and subconscious powers capable of producing potent results will be generated, just as any learned skill eventually takes root and becomes automatic, right? This is what happens in, for example, military training, where you are taught to go against your natural response of running away from gunfire or something like that. And it is so powerfully hammered into you and so repetitively done so that in the crisis, in the moment, that training takes over, and takes over faster than your conscious mind could possibly do. There's a great book called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. I highly recommend it, where he speaks about a certain football coach, American football coach, who had a theory that the way in which his team could succeed was not by making necessarily better plays or better strategy or anything like that, but simply nothing other than making his players' reaction times so fast by repetitively going over and over and over again the same plays, so that when it came time for the game, their unconscious reaction would be fast enough that it would give them the competitive edge over their competitors. So the same thing is being told here, that ultimately our unconscious behavior is so much more powerful that if we can take conscious behavior and repeat it enough times with enough emotional energy that it becomes deeply ingrained in who we are, then that's what's going to come out at a moment of crisis. As we noted, of course, this is contingent upon the sessions not being unduly interrupted. Additionally, the subject of study must be reinforced between sessions by periodic stimulation through Torah study. So what he's saying is that there's going to be two aspects to this. There's the intellectual pursuit of, let's say, studying proper behavior, right? So from a halachic or from a philosophical point of view, we want to be deeply engaged in the subject matter that we want to try to change. But then there have to be these moments, these moments of musar sessions, which are intense, emotion-driven periods of repetition and an arousal of the inner self to try to create an emotional attachment to this subject matter. The inculcation of Musar is based on the same process. If a person fervently devotes himself, each according to the condition of his disease in relation to divine service, to fervent Musar study, without extended interruption between study sessions, and with periodic stimulation, then subconscious powers will be engendered to aid him in the battle against rampant desire. Granted, this is no easy task for one who is burdened by his worldly affairs. Now, this is where the practical Rabbi Salanter comes in. He's going to say, when are we going to have time to do this? We're all working people. How am I going to have time to go seclude myself every day and generate a powerfully emotional experience that I can repeat daily? Moreover, there's another task that overrides everything else, the imperative to study Torah, which is the first thing for which a person is judged in the world of truth. So he's coming from a rabbinic point of view, which is this should not encroach on a Jew's regular obligation to study Torah. This is something in addition to that. So we have a limited time, is what he's essentially saying. Nevertheless, okay, this is the last page for anybody who's mindful of time. I did mention that it's going to go a little bit past 9 because I knew how much we wanted to go through, but this is the last page. Nevertheless, a person is certainly capable of going to the Beis HaMusar, which is a house of Musar. It's something that he told his students to set up in their hometowns a specific location dedicated to practicing this type of inner work. I wish such a thing existed today. There are one or two places like this in Israel that you can go to, where you can totally devote your time and energy to this type of repetitive emotional practice. But do it. What he's saying is, do it once a week. Do it on a Shabbat or on a weekend where you have enough time to really invest a lot of energy into this type of practice, where you can engage in art and Musar study, of course, devoting the majority of its time to Talmud study, which is the main focus. Likewise, you can go there several times a week, even if only for a few minutes. In other words, begin daily, begin weekly. Once a week, there should be an extended period of time where you are repetitively, emotionally inculcating into yourself whatever type of behavior or habit that you want to see yourself embody. And that way, when you revisit it during the rest of the week, it won't require as much time commitment as that original experience, because you can draw upon the emotional capital, if you will, that you generated for yourself on that Shabbat, and you can draw on it subsequently during the week and revisit it. And it becomes easier and easier for you to recreate that during the week in less time. Such a brilliant, he was really, really very much into not making any excuses whatsoever. So if he advocated for personal development, he also advocated for creating a practical game plan. He said, what's your plan B if your plan A doesn't work out? What's your plan C? Make sure that you are able to stick to something, a regimen that works, because if you've gone through all this trouble to theoretically create for yourself some plan, and then it gets derailed for some practical reason, you failed. You've got nothing. Okay. Such a program is easy to undertake and yields abundant fruit, aiding one to acquire the subconscious power to overcome his desires. At the very least, he will grant him the self-control to turn from evil and do good, especially concerning transgressions, which are relatively easy to avoid, things for which man, the self, will be held particularly accountable for in the eternal world of truth. So even if it doesn't implant in you a trained, unconscious, positive response to a given situation, it will at least create enough of a buffer zone whereby you can stop yourself and make a free will decision in the moment. Hopefully, one will realize that it is easy to go to the Beis HaMusar at any time of the day, with no disturbance or trouble, whenever it enters his heart, even if only for a few minutes. He should not let anything prevent him from going to the Beis HaMusar for undue interruptions, without brief and periodic stimulations between sessions, serve to render Musar study ineffective. Likewise, transgression is a spiritual precipitant that prevents Musar from rendering the desired effect, for it dulls man's heart and it makes it as hard as stone, chas v'shalom. He's pointing out something important here, which is that continued engagement in negative behavior is going to make you less receptive to positive behavior. So, for example, if I'm really trying to work on not gossiping about other people, the more gossip that I subject myself to, the more it will make me less susceptible to changing my ability to turn away from gossip, to resist the urge to speak more gossip, to walk away when somebody's speaking it. The essential remedy is Torah study, as well as to pray with feelings of subjugating oneself to Hashem. If this applies for you, great. If it doesn't speak to you, then to each their own. Preferably, one should gather together 10 like-minded people. First, they should study some Musar, and afterwards pray together to be saved from the evil inclination. And this, of course, is the final practical idea here, which is that it is way easier to do this type of work in a group setting, because it's reinforcing. It gives a greater sense of, first of all, of obligating yourself to the task at hand, but also it creates a sense of going through something important when you see that many people are doing this. So just to recap here, we have gone through many sources. The first ones show us to what extent we are afraid of our biases, to what extent we should be mindful of the fact that everything and anything can have a profound impact and can distort our judgment profoundly. The second section that we've discussed is how we have to own and be responsible for those biases, that somehow an unintentional behavior is more intrinsic to who we are, and so harder to rectify. And it's also something that there can't be zero catalyst for our behavior. Unintentional behavior just means that the will that caused it is more hidden. The third subject, the third topic, the third section that we discussed are practical ways of addressing our unconscious behavior. The first one by realizing very simply how we can address them on a very external manner, changing our dress, changing the way that we respond to external stimuli. The second one is by employing the idea of behavioral economics, nudge, and things of those sorts, where we can create nearly imperceptible changes in our environment that will penetrate deeply into the most subtle recesses of our unconscious. And then the third strategy employed is the head-on strategy, which is to make a plan. Find out what it is that you want to work on. Take not for now, but he actually outlines, what a person should do. Take, as it were, some sort of mantra. He suggests, finding some word of the sages, something from Pirkei Avot, for example, and effectively bringing oneself to a state of energetic and emotional fervor while repeating those words to oneself, so that you create a very emotional bond to what those are saying. And there are many ways of doing that. There's intellectual contemplation. There's many ways of arriving at this. But doing things that generate in us a deeply emotional response to that behavior, to that ideal, and then revisiting it at hopefully daily intervals for even brief periods of time during the week. And in so doing, we can reprogram ourselves to act out the behavior that we desire to embody. So that is a quick crash course in a representative sampling of some of the literature on the Torah's approach to the unconscious. I hope it was informative to you. Personally, I loved researching the topic. I think it's something that, if we're talking about how we as individuals, like we spoke about last week, if we as individuals really want to do something in this climate, if you feel inclined to protest, if that's the way you like to get in on things, that's great, or not so great, like whatever. I don't want to be political here at all, but I would say that that can't be the only thing that we do. There has to be some element of taking responsibility in our own lives for the imperceptible biases that we ourselves harbor, and so we got to make a plan. This is a small selection of an offering of ways in which everybody can do that. Thank you, everybody, for being involved. If anybody would like to have a copy of the source sheet, I'm more than happy to send it out. And I am opening it up to comments and questions. Any last comments or questions?
Thanks, Moshe. Hi. Just a general observation. It just seemed to me that every source that you brought in each section was very much geared towards the practical, whether it was the bias, in the courts, that you brought from the Talmud, or right at the end with the Mussar. And it seems to me that the Jewish tradition is very, very focused on the practical. It's not, think of John Rawls, philosopher's original position, the idea of unconscious bias. And he does that thought experiment, the veil of ignorance, where no one knows who they are, what race, what gender, what anything, even the person themselves sort of judging. And it seems that the Torah, Jewish tradition, not interested in theoretical positions that way. It's much more sort of geared towards actual sort of the practice. And I think that's very much ties in, I think, with what you're saying. It's just, it's not enough to kind of theoretically sort of discuss it. It's kind of what do we do in practice? And it seems to me everything that you've given today actually has that is predicated or sort of rooted in a kind of practical application. Seems to me sort of very, very useful to know that. Very helpful.
Well said. Yeah, thank you, Leah. Yeah, really well put.
And I would like a full sheet as well.
You'd like the source sheet as well. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your time, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Forward to being in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moshe. And if you could send me the source sheet, that'd be brilliant.
Will do.
Thank you.